A man walked to his death, and we wept. But the real question was this: why was that man never allowed to tell his own story? If that question unsettles you too, subscribe to Narrative Error, because on this channel, we never read a scene at face value.
The Green Mile etched itself into cinema history as one of the emotionally devastating films ever made. Adapted from Stephen King's novel and directed by Frank Darabont, it told a story set on death row. But The Green Mile was never just a prison film. It was a narrative where innocence, power, suffering, and justice intertwined. Throughout the film, viewers felt their chests tighten, their eyes well up, their throats catch. But beneath that emotional intensity, was the dramatic structure sound, or did the film use its emotional power to conceal a structural flaw?
The thesis of this video is as follows. The Green Mile contained one of the most effective narrative errors in cinema history. The film made John Coffey the emotional center of the story, but never gave him a true character arc. Coffey was the most powerful being in the film. He healed, he saw the truth, he sensed evil. Yet despite all that power, the narrative positioned him not as a character, but as an instrument. This was the Green Mile's narrative error.
Let us first look at the surface of the story. Paul Edgecomb served as the head guard on death row at Cold Mountain Penitentiary. He was a man who did his job with conscience, treated prisoners with humanity, and followed the rules. His life moved in a monotonous rhythm until John Coffey arrived. Coffey had been convicted of the rape and murder of 2 young girls. When he entered the corridor with his enormous frame, everyone saw a monster. But Coffey was no monster. He feared the dark. He was quiet. He was gentle. And it quickly became apparent that he possessed an extraordinary gift. He could heal through touch.
Coffey first healed Paul's urinary tract infection. Then he brought a mouse named Mr. Jingles back to life. After that, he destroyed Melinda Moore's brain tumor. Each miracle created an earthquake in Paul's inner world, because Paul now knew the man he was supposed to send to the electric chair might be innocent. Not just innocent, perhaps the purest being on that entire corridor.
This was precisely where the film's structural problem began. Paul Edgecomb's dilemma was dramatically powerful. As a guard, his duty was to execute the prisoner. As a human being, his conscience would not allow him to kill an innocent man. This conflict formed the film's backbone and shaped Paul's character arc. But what about John Coffey? Where was Coffey's character arc?
Coffey was introduced at the beginning of the film as a silent, fearful, and mysterious figure. At the end of the film, he remained the same, silent, fearful, and mysterious. He performed miracles in between, but those miracles did not change his inner world. Coffey never spoke about his past. We never learned where he came from. We never knew his family. We never knew what kind of life he had lived. We never knew how he discovered his power. The only thing we knew was that he suffered, that he felt the pain of the world, and that he was tired of that pain.
This was creating a symbol, not a character. Coffey functioned not as a dramatic personality, but as a thematic device. The role the film assigned him was this: be innocent, suffer, heal others, and then die. This role was emotionally devastating, but dramatically incomplete. Because for a character's tragedy to truly work, that character needed to have choices. Coffey's only choice was to accept death, and even that choice was presented almost passively in the film's final quarter. To understand this better, let us look at the other characters in the film. Consider Edouard Delacroix. Del was another inmate on death row. He was guilty, we knew that. But the film gave him a small layer of humanity. His relationship with Mr. Jingles elevated Del beyond being just a prisoner. It turned him into a person. Del's execution scene became horrific because Percy Wetmore did not wet the sponge. And we suffered for Del because we had come to know him. Even if only slightly, we had entered his world. Now consider, if even Del was this recognizable, why did Coffey, the film's actual emotional center, remain so unknown? Percy Wetmore was one of the clearly written characters in the film. He was introduced as a sadistic,
cowardly, power-hungry guard who took pleasure in exerting authority over defenseless prisoners. Percy's motivation was clear. In a world where he felt powerless, he wanted to be a petty tyrant in the one space he could control, death row. His sabotage of Dell's execution was a natural consequence of this character structure. Percy was evil, but it was a comprehensible evil. There was psychological consistency behind his behavior. Wild Bill Wharton similarly functioned as a comprehensible character. He was a chaotic, uncontrolled, instinctual agent of violence.
Wharton's presence threatened the order of the corridor and made concrete how difficult the conditions were under which Paul worked. Both Percy and Wharton, despite limited screen time, were consistent characters in terms of their motivations and behavioral patterns. So why, in the film's 3-hour runtime, was Coffey not given the same depth? The answer lay in the film's structural choice. The Green Mile was Paul Edgecomb's story. The framing narrative made this explicitly clear. It was Paul who recounted his memories from the nursing home. The film progressed from Paul's perspective and tracked Paul's emotional transformation. This choice was a legitimate dramatic decision, but its consequence was this. Coffey was placed in service of Paul's story. Coffey's reason for existence was not his own story, but his effect on Paul. There was another element that made it difficult to notice this structural deficiency: the film's cinematographic power. Thomas Newman's score, Roger Deakins' cinematography, and Darabont's staging created an emotional atmosphere every time Coffey appeared on screen. Even when Coffey did not speak, the camera captured the expression on his face in such a way that viewers believed they understood his inner world. But this was an illusion. The viewer saw not Coffey's inner world, but their own emotional projection. The film used its technical excellence to cover up its dramatic shortcoming. When the music swelled, when the light softened, when Duncan's eyes welled up, the audience stopped asking questions. But a character's depth is not measured by the quality of the technical elements surrounding them. A character's depth is measured by their choices, their contradictions, and their transformation. And Coffey had none of these. Now let us compare this structure with Paul Edgecomb's journey in detail. Paul began the film as an orderly government employee. He did his job, went home, loved his wife. After encountering Coffey, his worldview shattered. He felt for the first time with such depth how difficult it could be to distinguish good from evil. He confronted Percy Wetmore's sadism. He faced Wild Bill Wharton's malevolence. And ultimately, he was forced to send a man he believed to be innocent to the electric chair. Paul had a journey, one with a beginning, a transformation, and a cost. Coffey had only a function: to make Paul's journey possible. The film covered this imbalance with emotional intensity. The execution scene was one of the most harrowing scenes in cinema history. Michael Clarke Duncan's performance was extraordinary. Coffey's final words, saying he was afraid of the dark, shattered the viewer. But emotional impact cannot serve as proof of structural soundness, not from Coffey's individual story, but from his archetypal position. We did not know Coffey well enough to grieve for him specifically. We grieved for innocence itself. This distinction was crucial, because in great tragedies, a character's death shakes us because we knew who they were. Hamlet's death is tragic because for 5 acts we witnessed his hesitations, his rage, his intelligence, his contradictions. In Braveheart, William Wallace's death is devastating because we lived through his struggle, his love, his loss, his stubbornness. Even in The Shawshank Redemption, Andy Dufresne's escape moved us so deeply because for years we had come to know his patient resistance, his quiet intelligence, his vulnerability. So what did we know at the moment of Coffey's death? That he was innocent, that he suffered, and that he wanted to go. These 3 pieces of information sufficed for a symbol, but fell short for a character. At this point, a comparison within Frank Darabont's own filmography became unavoidable. Darabont had also told a prison story in The Shawshank Redemption, and that too was a Stephen King adaptation. But in Shawshank, Andy Dufresne was both the emotional and dramatic center of the narrative. We knew Andy's past. We saw his banking career, his wife's death, his wrongful conviction, the brutality of his first years in prison. Andy was a quiet character, But that quietness was a shell concealing the richness of his inner world. Throughout the film, his small victories, strategic moves, and silent rebellion built a cumulative force. We wept during the escape scene because we witnessed the result of 20 years of patient resistance.
Darabont had managed to give Andy Dufresne both symbolic meaning and individual depth. So why did the same director fail to give John Coffey the same depth in The Green Mile? The likely answer lay in the film's point of view choice. Shawshank was narrated through Red's eyes, but Andy's story stood as an independent entity. In The Green Mile, the story told through Paul's eyes always confined Coffey to an outsider's gaze. Coffey remained Paul's experience. He could never exist as his own.
What was particularly striking was that this structural choice also contradicted the film's thematic intent. The Green Mile wanted to tell the story of the justice system's blindness. It wanted to show an innocent man being destroyed by the system, but in doing so, the narrative itself exhibited a kind of blindness toward Coffey. The system did not see Coffey, did not listen to him, did not understand him. The film did the same. Rather than telling Coffey's story, it used his storylessness as atmospheric material. This created an unintentional but powerful irony. The film that criticized the injustice Coffey suffered replicated that same injustice at the narrative level.
Another structural issue in the film was the ambiguity surrounding the limits of Coffey's power. Coffey healed through touch. He saw the past through touch. He transferred evil through touch. But did this power have a cost? Did Coffey deplete a little more with each use? The film never made this clear. Coffey said he felt the pain of the world, but this pain never found a concrete dramatic counterpart. If every healing took something from Coffey, we needed to see it. If his power was slowly killing him, that tension needed to be constructed. But the film left this mechanism vague because it was not interested in building Coffey's inner world. Coffey was written not as an experience, but as an effect. The ambiguity of Coffey's power led to another problem. When healing Melinda Moores, Coffey absorbed the tumor into himself and then transferred that evil into Percy Wetmore. Percy, after this transfer, shot Wild Bill Warden and then fell into a catatonic state. This scene was highly functional narratively. It eliminated both Wild Bill and punished Percy. But the psychological dimension of Coffey's decision was never examined. Did Coffey consciously choose Percy? If so, this was a form of justice distribution. Did Coffey possess the power to judge as much as the power to heal? The film did not even ask this question, because it had no intention of entering Coffey's inner world. The scene worked effectively in terms of its consequences, but it remained empty in terms of Coffey's individual motivation. The scene where he used his power to reveal the truth about Wild Bill Wharton was one of the film's strongest moments. Coffey touched Paul, and Paul saw the real killer of the girls. This scene was narratively critical because it confirmed Coffey's innocence beyond doubt, but it also raised a question. Why had Coffey not shared this information sooner? He had carried this truth from his very first day. Why did he wait? The film had no answer, because Coffey's timing was calibrated not to his own motivations, but to Paul's dramatic needs. Paul's dilemma needed to ripen, the viewer's curiosity needed to peak, and only then could the truth emerge. This was the clearest indicator that the narrative used Coffey not as a character, but as a dramatic timing device. Coffey's manner of accepting death also deserved structural scrutiny. Coffey told Paul he no longer wanted to live, that he was tired of carrying the world's pain, exhausted from feeling the cruelties people inflicted on one another. This motivation was emotionally comprehensible, but dramatically insufficient, because we never saw the accumulation of this fatigue. We did not know when or how Coffey had begun carrying the world's pain. What was the final straw for him? Which moment made him say he could bear no more? The film answered none of these questions. Coffey's death wish was presented not as the culmination of a process, but as a pre-existing condition. It was as if Coffey had entered the story already wanting to die. And this, again, was an indicator that he was written not as a character, but as a thematic conclusion.
The film's final act told the story of Paul Edgecomb's cost. Having been exposed to Coffey's healing power, Paul stopped aging naturally. In the film's framing story, we saw Paul living alone in a nursing home. He had lost his wife, he had lost his friends, and Mr. Jingles was still alive. That little mouse, like Paul, had been sentenced to time. Paul's eternal life was not a gift, but a punishment. This concept was thematically powerful, but brought with it a structural question. Why did the film assume Paul deserved this punishment? Paul did the best he could. He could not save an innocent man, but that was the system's fault, not Paul's. Paul was a law-abiding guard, and the law had condemned Coffey. Paul was a conscientious man, and he suffered because he was conscientious. But the narrative framed this suffering as punishment. Whose punishment? Punishment for what? Why did Coffey's power transfer to Paul as a curse? The film had no answers to these questions because it papered over this mechanism with emotional atmosphere. Paul's loneliness in the nursing home saddened us, but this sadness did not rest on a logical foundation. A man trying to do the right thing and being punished for it would only be tragic if the narrative clearly demonstrated the source of that punishment. Otherwise, it was not tragedy, but random misfortune. Here it was also necessary to step back and ask, why did the film frame Paul's long life as a curse? In a different narrative, a long life could have been a gift. Paul, with Coffey's gift, could have helped more people, touched more lives, perhaps done what Coffey himself could not. But the film never considered this possibility. Paul's curse was necessary for the narrative's emotional closure because the film wanted to shake the viewer one final time. But this shock was born not from dramatic logic, but from atmospheric choice. Paul's loneliness in the nursing home functioned not as the logical consequence of a character's fate, but as a final chord completing the film's emotional note. So could The Green Mile have been written differently? What if the film had given Coffey a true character arc? If we had seen Coffey's past, experienced the moment he discovered his power, understood his relationship with the world, what would change? Perhaps we would learn that he once tried to save someone and failed. Perhaps we would see that when he first used his power, the people around him grew frightened and cast him out. Perhaps we would understand that Coffey had made a choice between being alone in this world and helping people. Then his death would have been not only emotionally, but dramatically devastating. Coffey's line about fearing the dark made us cry. But if we had known what that darkness was, if we had known Coffey's personal history with the dark, that line would have been not just an emotion, but a character truth. For a moment, let us imagine Coffey in the hands of a different narrative. Suppose the film had shown, in its first 30 minutes, a brief glimpse of Coffey's childhood, the moment he first noticed his power, a small scene of healing a bird, followed by the reaction of those around him, fear, exclusion, loneliness, and then Coffey learning to hide his gift, staying away from people, living alone in the woods. When he found the 2 little girls, he tried to save them, but arrived too late. And when he was found with dead children in his arms, no one believed in his innocence, because no one had ever known him. This backstory, even if it added only 10 minutes to the film's existing structure, would have given Coffey's death an entirely different depth. We would no longer be watching merely the death of an innocent. We would be watching the final act in the story of a man who had been misunderstood his entire life, left alone because of his gift, punished despite trying to do good. And at that point, the film's true potential would emerge. Coffey's statement about fearing the dark would no longer be a fear of death, but a reflection of the loneliness and exclusion he had experienced throughout his life. That darkness would not be the unknown after death, but the isolation in which Coffey had lived his entire existence. And then The Green Mile would have transformed from an emotional masterpiece into a dramatic one. The way Coffey was written actually drew on a pattern frequently encountered in cinema. In narrative theory, this is called the magical helper. In this pattern, a character possessing extraordinary powers enters the story to serve the main character's transformation. The helper character is wise, powerful, and often mysterious, but they have no story of their own or a very limited one. This pattern has recurred from ancient Greek theater to modern cinema. Characters like Gandalf, Yoda, and Morpheus are part of this tradition. But there was an important difference among these characters. Gandalf's past, motivations, and inner conflicts were developed across different layers of the narrative. Yoda's failures and regrets made him more than a symbol. Coffey, however, remained the purest, most unprocessed version of this helper pattern. The film accepted the pattern as given rather than interrogating it, and decorated it with emotional intensity.
Moreover, Coffey's confinement within this pattern contradicted the film's claim to tell a universal story. The Green Mile wanted to be a film that questioned the human condition and explored grand themes like justice and innocence. But exploring universal themes was not the same as reducing characters to universal symbols. On the contrary, the most universal stories were born from the most individual characters. Anna Karenina's tragedy was universal precisely because it was deeply individual. Raskolnikov's inner conflict concerned all of humanity precisely because it was entirely his own. Coffey, stripped of individuality, left the claim of universality hanging in the air. His tragedy belonged to everyone, and therefore to no one.
Narrative errors do not always emerge from bad films. Sometimes the best films carry the deepest structural problems, because emotional power makes structural deficiency invisible. When a viewer cries, they do not ask questions. They feel, they accept, and they move on. But fiction anatomy engages at precisely this point, looking behind the emotions, questioning whether the structure is truly sound, and sometimes finding the deepest cracks in the films we love the most.
The Green Mile was a beautiful film, but John Coffey never received the story he deserved. The film loved him but did not know him. It sanctified him but did not listen to him. And perhaps the greatest tragedy was not on the screen but behind it. The Green Mile's true narrative error was that the character we wept for the most was the character we knew the least.
If this analysis made you think differently, don't forget to subscribe to Narrative Error.